But yeah, it is what it is. Let's talk about the final club, Eintracht Frankfurt. And by the way, that Werder Bremen thing, I don't have the number in front of me, but Werder Bremen are the grave diggers of coaches in the Bundesliga this season. They've caused a bunch of coaches to be fired, including Erik ten Hag and including Dino Topmöller. His final game was against Werder Bremen as well. You've done a bunch of reporting on this. There is rumors out there that Marco Rose is the next head coach. Eden Terzic was linked with them, which I think you reported first before Sky picked it up. I've been told that they contacted Javi Alonso, and they said unrealistic, which tells me that he politely told them to go somewhere else. Maybe not quite as nicely as I mentioned it. But all these different names make me think or wonder, is there a plan? There's some that told me Marco Rose has always been the number one choice, but who knows? Who knows really what's going on? But what I do know is that the coaching change alone is not going to fix this, because once again, tonight Frankfurt go up 2-1 against Karabakh in Baku. And moments later, a low cross comes into the box, and there's Kao Santos trying to look for it. And we broke it down on the main show. He's been responsible for 10 goals against him this season. 10 goals. Not like that the other guy is much better. Setter has been responsible for 6.3 goals against him. So that's not much better. Which, scout a goalkeeper for crying out loud. You're not doing yourself any favors. It's literally cost you the Champions League spot. It cost you the Europa League final last season. I understand that the metrics and everything tell you that you signed a high potential goalkeeper who maybe down the road could bring you in a lot of money. But this is a game where in the end of the day where you need to be winning and not trying to sell a player for a profit to the Premier League. And I think this is my main criticism here, is that they have almost become too focused on bringing in players and selling them with a profit to another league. And yeah, maybe Santos will be that guy in 4 or 5 years. The problem is you're playing Champions League football right now. You're playing in the Bundesliga right now. You're playing against grown men right now. And the goalkeepers that you have in your squad aren't good enough. And your defenders in the squad aren't good enough. They're playing too far forward. They're playing too aggressive. They cannot hold the structure that Timo Topmöller tried to teach them. And, you talk to people inside the club, they're saying like, oh, Krischer addressed Timo Topmöller that he needs to fix the structure of the defense. And he's been trying, and the players aren't listening. Either they're not listening or they can't do it. Either way, not good. And this game is a great example of that. So like now the amateur coaches are in. But yeah, you sign a coach. Let's say Marco Rose becomes the next head coach, who handpicked by Markus Krösche because they were friends at Leipzig. And before that, worked together in the Red Bull system. Let's say he comes in. He's still going to have to deal with Theater and Koch and defense, etc. Santos and goal. That's a reality.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I've got nothing much to add. You've kind of took the words right out of my mouth, to be honest. Greg says in the chat, you should be texting Frankfurt executives and telling them to get defenders. They need only read my newsletter tomorrow for my opinions on that. And Manu's kind of made the very similar points there. Yeah, you're absolutely right. What I found fascinating about this game was that, okay, like Karabak's a tricky away game, right? I was reading reports about how Frankfurt struggled with to get there in the first place. A lot of players were held up in passport control. Although anyone who's gone through Frankfurt's own airport will appreciate that that's something the rest of us have to deal with when they go to Frankfurt. So you'd think the players will be used to that, but it's an obscene away day. It's a very long game and things like that. And Karabakh have pulled some big punches, or not pulled some punches. They've picked up some big scalps in the Champions League this season. So it wasn't a walkover by any means. But what's really interesting is that on Monday, Markus Krösche gave a press conference to kind of talk about Dino Topmöller sacking, and he said, one of the reasons we had to make a difference was our change is because we had to win these last 2 Champions League games. It's really crucial for us financially, etc., etc. The new guy comes in, not the new guy, the interim guy, as you said, the amateur coach comes in and plays the exact same team. I mean, maybe there's some minor changes there, but it's more or less it's more or less the exact same starting 11 that Topmuller would presumably have started in this game, and they played the exact same way as you would expect. They had some chances up front. Chanozone did something nice and scores a great goal, but then they concede two goals in comical fashion. That's just Frankfurt's entire season summed up, in my opinion. So unless they had some impression that they could bring in a new head coach on Monday or Tuesday, as you said, Marco Rosa, and immediately make a change so that they could pick up a result in this game, I'm not entirely sure what the better benefit was to sacking Topmuller before this match. Unless they'd simply got to the end of the tether with both parties and they said, it didn't really matter, let me sack you. We just all agree you have to move on. And to be fair, Croatia's more or less said, reading between the lines of what he said, it's very similar to what you see in football, and a lot of times where it's like, well, the unfortunate thing in football is it's a lot easier for a club to sack a head coach than it is to sack a squad. And if things aren't working out, they've only got so many levers they can pull, and one of them is to sack the head coach. And you're absolutely right. I think it could be Marco Rosa, it could be Jose Mourinho, it could be Pep Guardiola that comes in, and I think anyone's going to struggle with that back line. And crucially, also probably that midfield, which doesn't offer a huge amount of cover either. And we're seeing it time and time and time again. And it's going to be really interesting to see how Frankfurt kind of what solutions they come up with, because unlike Dortmund, and they can be quite proactive in the January transfer window when it suits them, but they've got Hoffenheim in the Bundesliga this weekend, which is going to be a really tough match. They then played Tottenham in the final match, even though they've been knocked out, so it doesn't really matter in the Champions League. Then they play Leverkusen, Union, Gladbach, and Bayern. And as things stand, I'm not really sure they're winning any of those 5 games, no matter who's in charge, unless they can make some serious changes in that back line. So I touched on it in my newsletter, Manu, but the Frankfurt get so much praise, admittedly, and not admittedly, deservedly so, for the way that they unearth these kind of incredible young attacking players and turn them into world stars. And in recent years, they've put a lot of money behind guys like Hugo Ekitike and Ritsu Doan and things like that. But that back three, if you will, those 3 key players, the goalkeeper, and Robin Koch, and then of course, oh God, I forgot his name there for some reason.
Theate,
I don't know why I lost me. Grand total of 19 million euros, I think. Christensen, maybe another 5 or 6 million euros. It's just been it's been completely overlooked, and for Croatia to sit in that press conference on Monday and say, no, I don't think the problem has been the lack of quality in defensive areas is utterly obscene. And do you know what, man? It's now in 3 years, the second head coach has either left the club or been sacked because the subplot, even if it's not in the official statement, it's fallen apart because that squad hasn't been good enough in key areas.
Yeah. I think that's a really crucial point. And, you don't sack Tino Topmöller that easily either, because like his father, Klaus Topmöller, big person in the club, right? Invented football 2000, played amazing football in the 90s with Eintracht Frankfurt. Dino Topmöller himself, a player who briefly played for Eintracht Frankfurt and scored 2 crucial goals to get them up back in the Bundesliga all the way back in the day. He is the Topmöller family is as closest to football royalty as you can get, and so to sack him, someone who's extremely popular with the fan base, is a strong and quite a controversial thing to do, and it's a huge deflection in my opinion. There's some reporting now in Germany that Eintracht Frankfurt's financial numbers, despite the sales, weren't that great this last season, and that's because when they sell players, they buy these younger players for an enormous amount of money with the hope that they would then sell them for an enormous amount of money to the Premier League, which they have been able to do. But, the investment into someone like Wahi, what did they pay for him? 35 million? Something like that. That is a big outlay. And I've been also told that Frankfurt pay among the highest salaries in the Bundesliga as well. And so, these are things that are now kind of weighing down this project a little bit. And maybe the shine that was on the amazing transfer business, the fact that they sold Kolumani for a lot of money, that they sold Marmoush for a lot of money, maybe, it isn't as good as it appears. And that will sooner or later reflect back on Krösche and his dealings. The fact that there's such a focus on signing these super talented strikers just to move them on when the basis is lacking. The fact that when the Itakuro transfer didn't happen, that no other defender was signed. And that goes back to this idea that when you sign a striker for a lot of money, you can faster capitalize on them by selling them on. But football is a business. But at the end of the day, if you for a Bundesliga team to not be in the top 6, the financial damage is enormous. And so the turnaround has to be quick, because otherwise the questions are going to soon zero in on the people above Topmüller.
Yeah, I do feel like Frankfurt are kind of walking on a high wire here, because financially speaking, and this is on my newsletter tomorrow, they've hit record revenues in the last 2 years, and they've more or less doubled their revenue from about 3-4 years ago. But a third of their revenue now comes from selling players. So a third of the entire business comes from selling players. And that's off the back of huge successes with Marmoush, Kolmouani, Ikitiki, etc. But it's completely overlooked the fact that they haven't signed the defensive players to kind of back that up. And I think it was Greg who made a good point, which didn't get a chance to touch on it when we were talking about Dortmund and Leverkusen, but he said, I've got a lot more faith in Leverkusen to keep that squad together and become a title challenger than Dortmund going forward. Yeah. And I think a real part behind that is, if you look at the money that Leverkusen spent in the summer, they spent a lot of money on big defenders. They signed 2 or 3 good centre-backs that they needed. They signed more full-backs, they signed more defensive players. Okay, they went out and got Flecken. That hasn't worked out, so they're going to go out and get their goalkeeper. Look at Bayern Munich. I mean, Bayern. I did actually look up at this for the newsletter. So their numbers are a bit skewed, because they get to get players on free because they're Bayern Munich. So they get Manuel Neuer for relatively free. They get Goretzka for free.
They pay big salaries, probably the biggest in Europe.
Oh well, yeah, for sure. But think about this. Think about the defenders they've signed in recent years. Kim costs as much as Olise. Upamecano, costs as much as a forward. Okay, maybe you're not going to get I guess Hernandez probably rivaled Luis Diaz, if you will. You can argue about whether that was a good idea or not, but aside from like Harry Kane, who's like a world-class striker who costs like a record transfer fee, Bayern aren't afraid to go out and spend their budget on defenders when they're needed. Leverkusen aren't afraid to spend their money on defenders when it's needed. And that's where I think Frankfurt are still trying to learn how to be a top 4 side, in the sense that they're still so kind of bewildered, or so kind of like a moth to the flame with the prospect of signing young, exciting, attacking players, because that's what the market wants. And they're like, well, if we sign these guys, we sell them, it helps us get to where we want to be quicker, i.e. at a revenue level with the likes of Leverkusen, Leipzig, Dortmund, etc. But they're skipping the steps in between, which is you have to buy the defenders, you have to get the goalkeepers, you have to have the defensive mids. They're not as sexy on Transfermarkt or on Football Manager as the wingers and things like that, but they're so crucial. And I think this season's a perfect example of why it all falls apart if they don't do that properly.
The squad building was bad. That's just the bottom line, isn't it? The squad building was bad. It lacked fundamentals, I think is the best way to put it. The foundation wasn't put in place. And that is something that they will have to look back on and say, okay, well, we did a great job signing a bunch of exciting strikers, but we did not replace Tuta and William Pacho. And that's a fact.
Yeah.
And then sending off Kevin Trapp without a good goalkeeper to replace him. Yeah, that's bad planning. And that goes beyond the head coach, I think, is maybe the final way to put it up. And it cost them a spot in the Champions League in the spring. So, yeah. All right, man.